This is the story of the man who made it possible, Sir Reginald Ansett. A story of a man with a vision and a great deal of persistence. In this program, we'll examine the man and his remarkable mission in life.
He was a fellow that came out of the bush, literally. He was a very down-to-earth fellow. He had no pretensions to grandeur in any shape or form.
The company was just like one big family, and they certainly admired him, adored him.
He had his wild dedication towards what he wanted to do, and this shone right through his entire career.
He was a shy man. He was a very much a family man.
So Reginald, apart from loving airlines, loved to fight.
This story might never have been told if he'd been alive today. For the man who created this aviation empire hated personal publicity.
Could you give us some reaction to the decision on the car rental?
Oh, well, look, Ross Alexander here will handle that for me.
How do you feel about it, Sir Reginald?
I feel all right.
This great aviation pioneer with basic education and only 2 qualifications, a sewing machine mechanic certificate and a pilot's licence, was to outshine all his opponents, to be knighted in 1969 for his services to aviation.
You certainly can't do anything really worthwhile if you're only prepared to work for 40 hours a week.
Reg Ansett was born in Inglewood, Victoria on February the 13th, 1909, one of 5 children to Charles and Mary Ansett. They lived in this house in Verdon Street. His father ran a bicycle repair shop and garage and later became mayor. That's him and his wife at the window when he opened the town's state bank in 1914. At the outbreak of World War I, Charlie Ansett joined the army and went to France. Reggie's family moved to Melbourne in 1914. His mother bought a knitting factory, the Ansett Knitting Mills, and they lived in this house in Mayston Street, Hawthorne. Mary, with 3 daughters and 2 sons to care for and educate, struggled to keep the wolf from the door. Reggie's schooling was cut short. Reggie's mother sent him to Swinburne to learn about mechanics, but more appropriately to learn how to repair knitting machines. That's how he ended up with the sewing machine mechanic certificate. He left school at 14, earning £7.10 a week, about $15. Good money in those days. Reg had his feet on the ground, but his head in the air. He was entranced by the feats of Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm. Smithy and Ulm had just flown the Pacific. Some say that Reg bore a strong resemblance to Smithy until his old age. Smithy and Ulm set up the first Australian National Airways, which went bust a year later. Little did Reg realise that he would eventually buy up the new A&O. Reg took to the air himself. He cashed in an insurance policy worth about £60 and learned to fly in 1929. He held Australian pilot's licence number 419. Reg learnt to fly at Essendon and went solo after only 4 hours dual instruction, falsifying his age by 2 years. He learned how to loop the loop, how to roll, how to fly inverted, how to do a falling leaf. He said later, Nobody showed us how to do these things, but there were plenty of books available on the subject. But with the Depression, he couldn't find a job as a pilot, so he set off for Darwin with the idea of growing peanuts, but landed a job as a lumberjack. It was while working as a lumberjack that Reg saw his other idol, Amy Johnson, fly overhead on her first solo flight from London to Australia. Reg dropped his axe, waved madly, and shouted as she flew over. Watching Amy Johnson make history and the impact of living such an isolated life made Reg Ansett think about the tyranny of distance. Getting around the country was a hard business in those days. Reg returned to Hamilton to start his one-man taxi business with the £50 he'd saved. But he was thwarted by government restrictions. A young and upcoming Attorney-General by the name of Robert Gordon Menzies introduced a new bill in Parliament intended to restrict road transport operators like Reg Ansett from competing with the railways.
The operation of the coaches then, with Bob Menzies enacting this law, meant that they were heavily fined, up to £1,000, and in those days that would send most operators broke. So what they decided to do is to take out a fruiterer's licence and sell each passenger going from Hamilton or Mount Gambier to Melbourne an orange, which cost £2.10, which is equivalent fare. So if they were pulled over, they had their fruiterer's licence and everyone produced their orange that they were carrying, and it was quite legal. So, but in the end, they really did decide that they had to get into the air.
You've got to remember, back in those days, the core of the business was the Pioneer Coach Lines. Pioneer Coach Lines actually paid to run the airline before the ANA takeover, and it was the cash cow. In those days, all the coaches were licensed on a state basis, and Victorian coaches weren't allowed to cross the border. So RM Pioneer Tours, as it was, used to drive as far as Albury, and then everyone had to get out and walk across the border and get in another coach which was registered in New South Wales. And he saw aviation as a means of breaking the back of that.
Like everything else, Reggie's entrance into aviation had humble beginnings. He bought his first plane, a Fokker Universal, for £1,000, and Ansett Airlines was born. On the 17th of February 1936, 60 years ago, that plane took off for Melbourne. The Hamilton Spectator wrote, "More than 200 people gathered at Hamilton Aerodrome to see the giant Fokker depart on its initial journey. Precisely at 12:30 p.m, the graceful metal bird took to the air and in a very few minutes was winging swiftly away." That giant aircraft, a real midget by today's standards, took a mere 6 passengers for £2 single fare, Hamilton to Melbourne, a journey of 1 hour 45 minutes on hard wicker seats. Graham, what was it like to travel in this aircraft in those days, in 1936?
It was obviously a very exciting era. Number one, you were dealing with new technology, which to us is old hat now, but they were dealing with new technologies and very big aircraft. These were big machines, or this particular aircraft was a big machine back in the mid-1930s. So I guess it was almost a feeling that people had when the first jumbo rolled out of the production line a few years ago. But it was an exciting era to many people, and that's mirrored in the reaction that people give when they see the aircraft.
Flying was a novelty. The money didn't exactly roll in. So, to supplement their earnings, Reg Ansett did what they called a bit of barnstorming. His pilot, Vern Kershay, took passengers on joy flights in the Fokker for 15 shillings a time, while Reg did aerobatics in the Gypsy Moth for 30 shillings.
I used to help the guys out there wash the aeroplane, the old Fokker Universal.
In his childhood, Ken Bond used to ride his bike to the airfield to watch, and eventually landed a job with Reg Ansett.
Oh, he always called me boy. He used to ask me what I was doing. "What are you doing, boy?" And he was always interested in what you did. And he used to always ask me, "How old are you?" Well, I'm 12. I'm 13. I'm 13 and a half. And one day he said, "How old are you today?" And I said, "I'm 14. In fact, it's my birthday today." So he said, "Do you want to start work for real?" And I said, "Well, I'll have to ask my father." So I couldn't get home quick enough.
Since his school days, it had been vitally important for Reg to come out on top, in business, in a race, or in just about everything else. In their newly acquired aircraft at Porterfield, Reg and his brother Jack won the 1936 Brisbane to Adelaide air race. Reg and Jack were up against some stiff competition. The race was based on each plane's engine capacity. With little knowledge of the terrain, it said much for Reg Ansett's flying skills, his courage and determination that he came out on top. For halfway through the race, the organisers changed the handicap rules, and Reg and Jack were pipped at the post. Reg protested, and after days of squabbling, the committee reversed its decision. The Ansett brothers won the prize of £500 and the trophy. In the same race was pioneer flyer Nancy Bird Walton, who won the women's section. She went on to compete in the commemorative Brisbane-Adelaide Air Race and is still flying to this day.
As Nancy Bird, she operated a one-aircraft charter service in Australia's outback in the 1930s.
Well, he was a very, very tough operator, and of course his famous quotation that he wouldn't have a woman pilot at any price. Now they've got 15 or 20 or something, was rather an indication of his determination to try and get his way.
The air war was hotting up in Australia. In July 1936, the second Australian National Airways was formed from Hollyman Airways and Adelaide Airways. The following year, Reg Ansett moved his base from Hamilton to Essendon Airport. With the backing of graziers, Ansett Airways was registered as a public company with a capital of 250,000 £1 shares. It was then that Reg Ansett bought his first real airliner, the Lockheed 10B Electra. Nothing like the monsters of today, like this 747 I'm sitting in, but a modern aircraft carrying 10 passengers with a crew of 2, and what's more, Reg's first aircraft to actually have a toilet on board. Ansett ordered 3 of the new Electras. This one, Ansette's, is the only original Ansett airliner still flying. In the 1930s, this was the last word in air travel. It was with the Electras that Ansett set up his first network, but money was short and Ansett shares slumped. That's when Australian National Airlines tried to buy him out. In the midst of the ANA takeover attempt came disaster. In a fire in this hangar at Essendon, 5 aircraft were destroyed, including the Fokker with which Reg had started the airline. Shares in Ansett slumped to 10% of their original value, but Reg didn't turn a hair. Amid the ashes of his airline, he told his staff to get on with the job the best they could.
We've had our ups and downs, but I knew that sooner or later something was going to crack in this aviation business.
After Reg Ansett's move to Melbourne, he became completely absorbed in expanding Ansett Airways. He frequently worked 18-hour days, but hated socialising and much preferred the comforts of home. In 1944, he married for the second time. His bride, Joan Adams, an Ansett Airways secretary, now Lady Ansett. They had 3 daughters, Janet, Jane and Gillian. When the working day was over, Reg Ansett came home to his 100-acre estate near Mount Eliza. Today, Lady Ansett lives in the house on the hill, surrounded by his trophies and memorabilia.
This was the office that was built when he retired.
And these are all his trophies and some of the aircraft you've used over
Yes,
there.
yes.
This is the famous one, though, isn't it?
This is, yes.
What is that exactly?
The trophy for the Brisbane-Adelaide Air Race.
So that really set him on his whole aviation career,
It did.
I suppose.
Yes, it did. I used to fly with him in the Tiger Moth, weekends, over the bay. And he was a bit of a daredevil, coming down over the yachts at St Kilda, and it was in his blood. He loved flying.
Reg's desk. Some people saw Reg Ansett as a sort of flying buccaneer, others as a business wizard, the sort of person that could make Australia into a great country. Persistence was his catch cry. He lived by this quote by the former American president, Calvin Coolidge. Nothing can take the place of persistence. Talent, genius, education are no match for persistence. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. Every day by the clock, Reg Ansett, or RM as he was known to his close associates, left his home at Mount Eliza to set off for work. His wife would wave him off. He was a stickler for punctuality and would expect all his employees to live by his code. Reg was the only businessman in Melbourne to come to work this way. Time was money to him. His helicopter would be met at the Yarra helipad by a chauffeur-driven car to take him to his Swanston Street office. Reg Ansett ran a very tight ship. He was a conservative man, always wearing a white shirt and traditional gold cufflinks, his hair slicked back and worn fairly short. Most of the big decisions were made by him. He disliked yes men. He spoke regularly of his responsibility to the company's 45,000 shareholders as though he was more a custodian than owner. But he held only 3% of the Ansett stock.
He was a very demanding boss, but he set the example with the drive and the determination and the grit to do whatever he wanted to do. If necessary, he used to say to me, well, what do you mean you can't do that? The rules don't allow it. Get the rules changed. This was his attitude, you know, and right through life. And it certainly paid dividends.
With the Second World War, Ansett's business fortunes were to take a new turn. Ansett abandoned its commercial operations and secured very profitable military contracts, ferrying troops from Sydney to Townsville and overhauling aircraft for the RAAF and the Americans. With the bombing of Darwin, Ansett came to the rescue in evacuating the civilian population, using 2 of his Lockheeds. As a result of its wartime activities, Ansett became financially stable and was ready to invest deeply in post-war operations. Once the war was over, Reg Ansett faced his toughest fight with the Department of Civil Aviation. The department had given its pre-war interstate routes to ANA, leaving Reg out in the cold. In 1944, the Labor Party had plans to nationalise the airlines. Reg loathed the thought of government and bureaucracy getting in the way of private enterprise. "Bloody bureaucracy," he would shout. But he knew he had to work in with government, even though he never entirely trusted politicians. He diversified into hotels, television, finance companies, mining, and even a ballpoint pen company. He opened up Daydream and Hayman Islands, using the giant Sikorsky helicopters. And in New Guinea, he found many new customers and carried their excess baggage. What was behind all this diversification? Was it a fear of government interference?
I think he realised that the business, the company itself, had become far too reliant on aviation. And through some of those times in the 70s, 80s, he was very vulnerable to the union situation. You know, pilots, flight attendants, engineering unions could ground the airline, and you know, you were talking very big amounts of money. If you put the airline on the ground for a couple of days, you weren't talking hundreds of thousands, you were talking millions of dollars. Sure. And he, I think, diversified as a policy because he wanted the company to become more broad-based, so that if somebody pulled the airline down around him for a period of time, he had cash flow and he had money coming from other sources.
But Reg Ansett's main interest was in the air, and he couldn't carve a niche in the market. The government-subsidised Trans-Australia Airlines, TAA, formed in 1946, had cornered the routes. Reg never gave up.
In those early days, the government philosophy and the public's philosophy, the government could run anything. And while there was government airline having half the business, not having to pay taxation and not having to pay dividends and having monopolies of government business, R.M. Ansett was a great fighter, and he was always fighting the government to get this economic equality.
Mascot Tower from Butler's Able Oboe Howe. Taxi instructions, please. Over.
Able Oboe Howe, this is Mascot Tower, Roger, you're clear.
If the government wouldn't play ball, then Reg Ansett would look for another avenue. He made a bid for half stake in Butler Airlines of New South Wales, owned by an Englishman, Arthur Butler, with a fleet of piston engine and prop jet aircraft. Butler, backed by the state Labor government, said no. But they didn't count on Reg Ansett's persistence.
Able Baker off at 12.26.
When Butler started competing in interstate, RM said, now this has got to stop. Butler wouldn't. So we converted all our shares into parcels of 100 and gave it to all our employees, which gave them all our shares, one share, one vote. Then the annual general meeting came up at a hangar at Mascot, and we flew up about 300. Well, it was between 300 and 400 shareholders. The whole fleet was mobilised that day to send them all up. Gave them lunch and lunch boxes, and they all voted, you know, for RM Ansett.
When you look back in retrospect and think the whole of an organisation being flown up to Sydney, and it was all catered for, there was, you know, lunch and booze, and the whole shooting match was turned on. We had a ball.
I wouldn't have thought Mr. Butler was very impressed, though.
No, he wasn't. No.
Now, you may be able to detect a sort of undercurrent of excitement here. I'll tell you. When this couple were first married, they could still travel in a horse cab. But today, as an anniversary highlight, I believe, they're trying flying for the first time.
After the Butler saga, Ansett formed a subsidiary airline, Airlines of New South Wales, which mostly served the rural areas.
On behalf of Airlines of New South Wales and your crew, we trust you have enjoyed your flight.
Now, air services and good air services are absolutely vital to Australia. We could not go on and expand without very good air services.
When the Labor Party were defeated in 1949, the new Liberal government, led by Robert Menzies, decided that TAA and ANA would be allowed to compete on trunk routes and share in the perks of mail carriage, government business and aid for equipment. Ansett was still out in the cold, but he never gave up pursuing Menzies.
I several times flew him to Canberra, where he literally sat outside Sir Robert Menzies' door awaiting an interview, or when he wouldn't be granted an interview, and just sat outside and grabbed him every time he went to the toilet.
It wasn't until 1952 that Ansett was allowed to fly the Melbourne-Sydney route. Their DC-3s carried 28 passengers. By then, Ansett had 5% of the market and was growing strongly. Ansett extended its services by going into the flying boat business. It bought Transoceanic Airways and merged it with Barrier Reef Airways to form Ansett Flying Boat Services, with a network to Brisbane, Hayman Island, Townsville, Cairns and Lord Howe Island. The graceful Sandringham and Sunderland flying boats operating from Sydney Harbour were pure pre-war nostalgia and lingered on until the 1970s in what was one of the most romantic air services anywhere in the world. TAA, though, pushed further ahead when it introduced the first domestic pressurised air service with the Convair 240. The competition proved too much for ANA and its boss, Sir Ivan Holliman. A departmental inquiry decided the airline was in financial trouble. That's when Reg Ansett took the biggest gamble of his life. The tiny Ansett Transport Industries tried to buy out ANA for more than £3 million. The only trouble was, Reg didn't have the money.
We had no money. Now, it was absolutely extraordinary because ANA was a big company. £3.3 million was asked. And that was an enormous sum in those days. But we got it by the help of primarily the oil companies, Shell, I must say. Shell came to the party, and the banks, ANZ Bank.
This gave us all grey hairs. In fact, he came out on bumps in his own face.
Ansett Airways bought ANA, the mouse swallowing the elephant. And of course from Reg it was, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full.
To start with, the merged airline, Ansett ANA, faced tremendous problems. Their own executives were only attuned to working and planning a small operation. Now Reg Ansett was in the big time with big boys' toys.
I think he must have had an inborn capacity beyond the average, much beyond, that grew with age, with experience, with maturity, that just enabled him to apply himself in a way that's very unusual.
He was a very demanding boss, and but he set the example.
If you were lucky enough to acquire a new push bike, he'd want to know where you got it from. He'd want to know how much you paid for it. Whose car's that out there? It's mine, Mr. Ansett. Where'd you get that from? You know, it was almost like I'm paying you too much money if you can afford to buy a car like that.
I mean, every employee would work 180 to 200% without asking, because he had that relationship and that empathy with people. A lot of people felt that he didn't pay very well.
I've heard that from just about everybody, that he was a skinflint.
Exactly, and perhaps that's true, but on the other hand, we can't explain why we all work so hard for him, and I think it was the magic of the man.
Pretty soon, we'll see them approach and touch down. First touchdown of a tri-motored aircraft since Kingsford Smith in 1928. Now, that's really quite a thing. We're witnessing some history today.
As traffic grew, both airlines moved quickly to the introduction of jetliners in the 1960s. Reg Ansett quickly grasped the advantages of the Boeing 727, while TAA wanted the de Havilland Trident. Reg won out with good reason. The 727s could provide the capability needed to operate in and out of Essendon with a full load, 6 years before Tullamarine was built.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the first of the two fan jets, the Ansett ANA Boeing 727 fan jet, is approaching to land. You can see it now with its flaps down, its undercarriage extended, and Captain Lovell by now will be working fairly hard to stop her sliding across the runway. She's down now, you can see all the flaps, and now he goes into reverse.
Minutes later came TAA's 727. Reg Ansett had made sure his jet was going to be first past the post.
There was no way he was going to have a toss of the coin to see who was going to land their aircraft in Australia first. We had to have that, and that meant we had to leave in the smaller hours out of Honolulu to land the aircraft ahead of TAA at the time and go against the plan where the government was supposed to be the first to land their jet in Australia.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. How was the flight?
Wonderful flight, very good. Everything went perfectly, and a beautiful aeroplane.
Tell me, sir, why did Ansett ANA specifically select the 727 as a Viscount replacement?
Well, it's not a Viscount replacement. It's the jet age now, and it's the best jet for this type for inside Australia, the best jet in the world, and it's as fast as anything in the world. So it's the best, and it's just good enough for Australia.
Menzies could see that Ansett ANA might get too big for its boots. That's when he formed the two-airline policy, which in effect put a clamp on Ansett ANA, outrivaling TAA.
The public perceived that he was getting favours all the time, when in fact he was behind economically and fighting to get equality with the government airline, which he ultimately did.
The establishment of the two-airline policy at least gave Ansett an equal share of the market. It meant there was to be no cutthroat competition between the two airlines. But the result was farcical.
Come on and fly! Up and away!
Show you someplace special for you. We make it easy for you.
It meant, for instance, that each airline would have the same number of gate lounges at Tullamarine. Almost identical planes with the same seating capacity, the same number of hostesses, the same number of flights taking off at virtually the same times. The object was to ensure there would be no cutthroat competition. Some saw it as a ridiculous policy directed at preserving the position of the two airlines at the expense of the public.
We would have ended up in either of two situations. We would have ended up with a single airline, government-owned, or a single airline, private enterprise-owned, but more probably, almost for certain, government-owned. The public would have had no choice whatsoever.
The public get a better deal out of a competitive system. This certainly keeps us on our toes.
Outside of business, Reg Ansett's big interest was horse racing. He was chairman of the Mornington Racing Club, and when he died, gave $20,000 a year to hold a feature race, the RM Ansett Stakes.
What do you say? What do you say? Nibbles? What do you say? Good boy.
His racehorse, Nibbles, now 17 years old, which won many races in its time, still survives on the Mount Eliza estate.
This was one of the horses that Sir Reginald gave you?
Yes, yes, he left these two and lad over there to me, and they were his last race horses, trained by Tommy Woodcock.
Reg Ansett admitted to being a bit of a gambler. He once said he'd often tossed a coin to make a decision and had been lucky. But the biggest punt of his life was when he made a bid to run Qantas. In 1946, he wrote to the Department of Transport saying he could soon bring Qantas into profit. The Secretary of the Department of Transport replied, quoting a biblical proverb, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid." Reg replied, quoting John chapter 11, verse 35. The message read, Jesus wept. By 1971, Ansett had assets of $187 million, listing it among the top 40 commercial enterprises in Australia. Sir Reg's ownership was still only 3%, however, making him very vulnerable to takeovers. It wasn't surprising when a takeover bid came from Thomas Nationwide Transport, TNT, a company a quarter the size of Ansett.
Did he regard you as some sort of interloper, though? I mean...
Oh, absolutely. Because he was convinced. I don't think he had any problem with me personally by the time Sir Reginald got to the stage where we really had the takeover. No, he was only convinced that I'm only doing it as an exercise to sell up Ansett and use what I can use for TNT and destroy his baby.
The offer was rejected by the Ansett board. Reg Ansett issued a fighting statement. We will not be taken over. The Victorian Premier, Sir Henry Bolte, Sir Reg's old racing mate and friend, came to Ansett's aid on that occasion.
I certainly talked to the Premier and asked him and told him that I consider the matter was very serious, that it needed to be looked at carefully by governments before it was allowed to take place. I think that we are here dedicated to looking after what is the private enterprise section of aviation.
State Parliament restricted TNT's 23% shareholding in Ansett to 10% voting power.
Sir Reginald invited me and said, look, you can come on the board, but I tell you one good advice. You can't just run around in the world and do business and not even worry who the politicians are and where they are. That's what I underestimated. The political reality of particularly politically sensitive businesses, I didn't even think of it until Sir Reginald gave me a great lesson. I can tell you I was like a little boy beaten at all ends.
The 70s were to prove turbulent years for Sir Reg. For 40 years he'd kept a tight rein on his business empire, but he was beginning to lose his touch. Associated Securities Finance Company, in which he had a 48% stake, collapsed with losses of more than $100 million. The crash was to have unforeseen consequences.
ASL was a company that he picked up, and their assets were long-term investments in land, and they borrowed short and invested long, and they had to pay a huge interest bill on the borrowings. And as it turned out, I mean, you know, the policy was right in that the land they had, I remember looking at the portfolio of land, they literally owned Surfers Paradise. All of the land at the back of Surfers Paradise was ASL's. Right down through the canal areas today, they owned it. But they just couldn't support the loans.
Truly, I was the one that did all the investigation with underwriters and whatnot into ASL. And it was the worst mistake I ever made in my career in recommending it to the board.
He made a call at a board meeting and said no more money for ASL. That took ASL out, and the share market collapsed around Ansett, and the price dropped to whatever it got to, 60 cents or something or other. And within hours, the takeover bid was on.
Did that break him
Well, I mean, you can say that, I suppose, but even if he'd had 10 or 15%, I don't think it would have made any difference at that time frame. No, it was. I mean, there were forces put at work because of the ASL problems and so forth that saw the share price fall so far that I mean, it just became well, obviously a target. I mean, one half of the two airline policy of Australia on the market at a price which was so cheap. Wish I'd had some money.
A country businessman who needs a car for a busy day in the city need not bring his own. On arriving at the city airport, he's only to call at the Avis desk in order to hire a late model car which he can drive himself.
The ASL collapse wasn't the only blow for Sir Reg. He came unstuck with Avis rent-a-cars, which Ansett had bought in 1977 for nearly $10 million. The competition came from Budget Rent-a-Car, run by his son Bob. But eventually, Avis lost the airport franchise because it didn't make a high enough bid.
We had a board meeting, Christmas Eve '79, at which for the first time in the history of that company he wasn't in absolute command at the board table. I mean, he had new faces that were not going to be essentially loyal to him at all. And he became very ill within 48 hours.
Sir Reg had just turned 70, and there were suggestions that his two major defeats with ASL and Avis might force him to relinquish his tight managerial control of Ansett Transport Industries. The challenge was not long in coming. The first move came from Robert Holmes à Court, the wealthy West Australian businessman. He bought 5% of Ansett's capital and 4 months later held 12.5% of the company, valued at $13 million. He claimed he would buy up to 20% of the stock if Reg Ansett gave him a controlling interest in the Melbourne and Brisbane TV stations. So Reg was happy for Holmes à Court to succeed him. But that wasn't to be. In October 1979, other players entered the fray. News Limited's Rupert Murdoch and TNT boss Sir Peter Abels. They carved up Ansett Transport Industries and pushed Sir Reg into the cold. Sir Peter was already on the board. Now he became chief executive. How did you end up before he died? Were you good friends?
I can't say good friends. We always had a very correct and even friendly relationship. I was 8 years a director of his. And in those years when he had problems, I stood by him, you know, so as a director. So he knew that I'm not a bastard who takes advantage of his hard times. I stood by him in those years.
But was there a coolness?
It was not cool. It was a if anything, he was, in my view, Sir Reginald, at that stage of his life, he was worried about me. Because this was not an excuse. He really thought I will come in and wreck his airline.
It was a body blow from which Sir Reg never recovered, to stand by and watch his empire disintegrate before his eyes.
He called me into head office one day to talk to me about a new position that involved me, and he was looking down when I walked into his office, and he looked up at me like that, and he said, of course you know I'm not the managing director of this airline anymore, but I would like your opinion because I have to pass it on to other people or something. And it was the way he looked at me, and it was almost like he was about to burst into tears, telling me, who'd worked for him for so long, that he just didn't belong anymore, you know, and I felt terribly sad for him.
He was devastated, but I think he realised that the time had come for change. His main concern was for the future of his dedicated and loyal employees.
Most assuredly, at the end of it, when he lost control of the company, obviously that had a serious effect upon him personally.
He didn't mind the size of the problem in anything he did, provided he could see somewhere daylight, but we couldn't see it here.
I've become an administrator now, and that means you're not an expert at anything at all. The man that makes the bus or flies the aeroplane, he gets a lot more kick out of it.
Reg Ansett died at the age of 72 on the 23rd of December 1981. He had dominated the aviation world in Australia for Sir Reg Ansett had travelled a long road since that one-man taxi business in 1931. In 6 decades, his fleet had grown from a single aircraft to more than 80. The travelling public had known and loved planes like the Lockheed 10, the DC-3, the Friendship, the Sandringham Flying Boat, the Electra, the Viscount, and the DC-6. It's astonishing to think that Reg Ansett's £1,000 plane sowed the seeds of a great airline. In 1936, the Universal carried 6 passengers 800 kilometres at 143 kilometres an hour. In 1996, this Boeing 747 can carry more than 400 passengers halfway round the Earth.
The opportunity to go to be a true international airline flying 747s is something that was a step on from what his vision was, but I have no doubt that he would have been delighted about it.
Ansett Australia now enters the 21st century with aircraft of intercontinental range and routes to Hong Kong, Kuala Lumpur, Osaka, Bali, Taipei and Jakarta. Sir Reg had long envisaged the day that Ansett would go international. That airline is a credit to the persistence of a great Australian. What is it about Ansett Airways that's been so different, so special?
Ansett.
The man.
Yes, absolutely.